always thought my life was normal, working the usual 9-to-5 job in a plain office, going home to my small apartment, and trying to maintain a regular routine. Everything was fine until I was assigned to a new project at work, one that required me to spend extra hours in the building. That was when everything began to change. The office building where I worked was located in an old part of the city, surrounded by narrow alleys and streets that were eerily silent at night. The building itself was just as unsettling, a gray structure with 7 floors, each dimly lit and filled with the hum of air conditioning. It was mostly empty after hours, with only a few employees remaining behind, working late into the night. One night, after staying late to finish a report, I took the elevator to the 7th floor to grab some documents from the archives. The 7th floor was rarely used. It had a cold, eerie feel to it, as if it had been abandoned long ago. But that night, as I stepped out of the elevator and into the dark corridor, I felt something strange. The air was heavy, and I could hear faint whispers, too faint to make out but enough to send chills down my spine. I tried to brush it off as the result of fatigue and stress. After all, it had been a long day. But the further I walked into the hallway, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The dim lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. I found the archive room at the far end of the hall. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, rows of dusty filing cabinets stood like sentinels in the dark. I quickly gathered the documents I needed, eager to leave and return to the safety of my apartment. But as I turned to exit, I saw her. A figure vague at first stood in the far corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows. Her long black hair fell over her face, and she wore a simple white dress. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel her eyes on me, watching. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But she was there, undeniably real, and the coldness in the room intensified. I backed out of the room, my eyes never leaving her, and stumbled into the hallway. The elevator seemed a million miles away, but I forced myself to walk, trying to keep calm. When I reached the elevator and pressed the button, I could still feel her presence behind me, though I didn't dare turn around. The doors opened, and I rushed inside, slamming the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of her standing at the end of the hallway, her head tilted slightly, watching me leave. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her standing in the corner, her pale face hidden behind her hair. By morning, I convinced myself it was just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. After all, I had been working long hours, and my mind was bound to play tricks on me. But things only got worse. Over the next few days, I began hearing strange noises in my apartment, whispers in the walls, soft footsteps when I was alone, and the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just paranoia. But the fear grew stronger, especially at night. One evening, as I sat in my living room trying to relax, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, almost hesitant. I opened the door, expecting a neighbor, but no one was there. I looked down the hallway, empty. As I closed the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. The temperature in the room had dropped suddenly, and the air felt thick, oppressive. I turned around, and there she was. The same woman from the archive room, standing in the corner of my living room. Her head was slightly lowered, her hair falling over her face. This time, I could see her eyes dark, hollow, and filled with a hatred that made my blood run cold. She moved, just slightly, but enough for me to realize she wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, and no sound came out. She took a step forward, and I bolted for the door. I ran out of my apartment, down the stairs, and into the street, gasping for air. I stood there, trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't return to my apartment that night. Instead, I stayed at a friend's place, too afraid to go back. The next day, I confided in him about what I had seen, though I left out the part about the woman. I didn't want him to think I was crazy. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was following me, something dark and malevolent, and it wasn't going to stop. I went back to the office, hoping to find answers. I asked around about the building, but no one seemed to know much about its history. It was just an old office building, they said, with nothing particularly special about it. But one of my co-workers, an older woman named Mrs. Rama, seemed uncomfortable when I mentioned the 7th floor. "Stay away from that floor," she warned. "There are things up there, things you don't want to disturb." When I pressed her for more information, she hesitated but finally told me an old story. Years ago, before the building was renovated, the 7th floor had been part of a hospital, a psychiatric ward. Patients had died there under mysterious circumstances, and some believed their spirits still lingered, trapped in the building. The more I listened, the more I realized that what I had seen was no hallucination. Something had been left behind on that floor, and I had disturbed it. That night, I made a decision. I had to go back. If I wanted this to end, I needed to face whatever it was that was haunting me. I packed a small bag with salt and a few other items I had read could ward off spirits, though I wasn't sure how effective they would be. Returning to the building felt like walking into a nightmare. The 7th floor was darker than I remembered, the lights dimmer, the air colder. I could feel her presence before I even stepped out of the elevator. I made my way back to the archive room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I entered, the door closed behind me with a soft click. The room was as silent as a tomb, but I knew she was there. I could feel her watching me from the shadows. "I'm not afraid of you," I whispered, though my voice choked. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, she appeared, her figure materializing out of the darkness, standing in the same corner where I had first seen her. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice a low, rasping whisper. I froze. She had never spoken before. But now, her voice filled the room, echoing off the walls. The air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. Her voice, cold and rasping, echoed in the room, sending chills down my spine. I stood frozen, trying to muster the courage to move, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. The air was heavy with an oppressive force, pressing down on me with an invisible weight. The grotesque smile on her face twisted further, and her dark, hollow eyes seemed to pull me in, drawing me closer to her darkness. "You shouldn't have come back," she repeated, her voice even lower, like a distant growl. I wanted to speak, to scream, but my throat tightened. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. She began moving toward me, each step slow and deliberate. Her presence felt suffocating, like the air was being sucked out of the room. With a burst of desperation, I finally broke free from my paralysis. I turned and lunged for the door, yanking it open with trembling hands. My legs carried me down the corridor as fast as they could, but it felt like I was running through quicksand. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, the walls narrowing around me as if the building itself was trying to trap me. Behind me, I could hear the soft padding of her bare feet on the floor, a steady rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The whispers grew louder now, swirling around me, but they were no longer unintelligible. I could hear words, warnings, threats, and cries for help, all blending into a cacophony of voices in my ears. I reached the elevator and slammed the button repeatedly, praying for the doors to open before she caught up. As the sound of her footsteps grew closer, the doors finally slid open with a soft ding. I stumbled inside, slamming the button for the lobby. The doors closed just as I saw her figure round the corner, her eyes locked on mine, her smile wider than before. The elevator descended, and I slumped against the wall, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. When the elevator doors opened in the lobby, I bolted out, not caring if anyone saw the panic on my face. I ran out of the building and into the cold night air, collapsing onto a nearby bench. My chest heaved as I tried to calm myself, but my mind was still racing. I thought about the woman, the terrifying force she carried with her. She wasn't just a ghost, she was something more, a malevolent entity that had been trapped in that building, her anger and hatred feeding off the fear of anyone who encountered her. And now, she had chosen me. But why? Why me? What had I done to attract her attention? I needed answers, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been missing something crucial. The story about the 7th floor being part of a psychiatric ward was just a piece of the puzzle. There was something deeper, something older that tied the building, the woman, and the voices I had been hearing together. I pulled out my phone and searched for any historical records about the building before it became an office. After hours of digging, I finally stumbled upon something chilling. Before it was a hospital, the land the building was on had been the site of an old, dilapidated mansion owned by a family infamous for its involvement in occult rituals. The mansion had been burned down in a mysterious fire, killing several members of the family. Rumors spread that the fire was started as part of a ritual gone wrong, trapping restless spirits in the land forever. When the hospital was built, the 7th floor was directly above the mansion's original foundation. The woman in white wasn't just a lost spirit, she was part of something far more sinister, a product of whatever dark forces had been unleashed decades ago. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. The hospital had been plagued with strange incidents ever since it opened, patients disappearing, staff members reporting ghostly sightings, and even a few unexplained deaths. It had been shut down after a particularly gruesome series of events, and the building was abandoned for years before being repurposed as an office. The woman haunting me was likely one of the original family members, or perhaps a victim of their rituals. Either way, she wasn't the only one trapped there. The voices I had heard in my apartment, the footsteps in the night, they were all part of the curse that lingered on the land. And now, by going back to the 7th floor, I had drawn her attention again. I realized that if I didn't do something, she would continue haunting me. The fear gnawed at me, but I also felt a strange sense of responsibility. If I didn't stop this, she might not only haunt me but also others who came to the building. She had to be put to rest. But how could I end a curse that had lasted for so long? I couldn't do this alone. I needed help from someone who understood the supernatural. After searching online and making a few discreet inquiries, I found someone, a paranormal investigator with a reputation for dealing with spirits. When I contacted him, he was skeptical at first. But after I described the woman and the events on the 7th floor, he agreed to meet me. We met in a cafe, the dim lighting casting long shadows over the table as we discussed my haunting. ADI listened intently, nodding as I told him about the figure I had seen, the whispers, and the curse tied to the building. "This isn't just a ghost," he said, echoing my own thoughts. "What you're dealing with is a spirit bound by something much darker. She's trapped, yes, but her anger and hatred are keeping her here. Whatever ritual was done, it didn't just summon her, it gave her power. And that power is growing." I swallowed hard. "So, how do we stop her?" ADI leaned back, his expression serious. "We'll need to break the curse. That means going back to the 7th floor, finding the source of her power, and destroying it. But we'll need to be prepared. She won't let us do it easily." A few nights later, ADI and I returned to the office building. The weight of what we were about to face hung heavy in the air. ADI had brought several tools with him: protective charms, salt, and incense. He also carried a small journal filled with handwritten notes and sketches, detailing rituals that could be used to banish spirits. We stepped into the elevator, and as it ascended, I felt the familiar chill return. The building seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy, as if it knew we were coming. When the elevator doors opened on the 7th floor, the atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the lights flickered weakly overhead. The hallway stretched out before us, dark and foreboding. "This is it," ADI whispered, lighting the incense and muttering a quiet prayer under his breath. We walked toward the archive room, the same room where I had first seen her. As we approached, the temperature dropped even further, and I could hear faint whispers all around us. They were louder this time, more insistent, like a chorus of voices warning us to leave. But we pressed on. We had come too far to turn back now. As we entered the archive room, I could feel her presence immediately. The woman in white stood in the corner, her figure more solid than before. Her eyes glowed with malevolence, and the air crackled with a dark energy. "You shouldn't have come back," she hissed, her voice filled with rage. ADI stepped forward, holding the protective charms in front of him. "We are here to free you," he said calmly, though I could hear the tension in his voice. "You don't have to stay here any longer." Her smile twisted into something cruel. "I don't want to be free," she snarled. "I want you to suffer." The room erupted in chaos. The lights flickered violently, and the air swirled with shadows. The walls seemed to close in around us as the temperature dropped even further, freezing cold now. I could barely see through the darkness, but I could hear her moving closer, her voice echoing all around us. ADI began chanting, his voice steady despite the chaos. The incense smoke filled the room, and the charms in his hands glowed faintly. I held my breath, praying that it would work, that we could end this nightmare. But then I saw her right in front of me. Her face was twisted in rage, her eyes burning with hatred. She reached out, her cold fingers brushing against my skin, and I felt a jolt of pain shoot through my body. I screamed, falling to the ground as the room spun around me,